Lisa Newton develops a theory of virtues and roles, building on the ideas of Bob Solomon. The idea behind her approach is to say that, yes, it is absolutely true that my responsibilities are going to be shaped by the role I play. And so I have to think about the community I'm a part of, specifically the organization that I'm a part of, and my role within that organization. In becoming a part of that organization, I am committing myself to put my employer's interests first. I have a prima facie obligation of loyalty to my employer and to serve my employer's interests. That's important, and I'm placing myself under the power of that employer. After all, that employer may promote me, can give me raises, but can also push me into another job, may require me to move to another part of the country, may fire me. And so I am placing a lot of power in the hands of my employer, and I am committing myself to serve that employer's interests. Well, why am I doing that? Well, for a paycheck in part, but in part because fulfilling my role as a human being is in part to work. Sigmund Freud said that psychological health came down to two things: to love and to work. Of course, many aspects of my responsibilities within a company are defined by my particular role. I have a certain job to do. I have a certain set of responsibilities attached to that job, and certain criteria for what it is to do that job well. So those give me certain responsibilities and certain criteria of excellence that are going to shape the virtues required for that particular job. Yes, I should be loyal to my employer, all other things being equal, but I should also then have a number of different traits that are associated with that particular job. The traits of a project manager are going to be different from the traits of an attorney, for example, or the traits of an accountant. And so my particular role within the company is going to shape what it is to do my job well, and thereby the responsibilities that I have, and the criteria that determine what it is for me to do my job well. What is it to develop as an employee? Well, Aristotle already describes what that amounts to, really. It is not simply to take on that general responsibility to the company of loyalty, and then whatever the specific responsibilities of my job are. I start by having to be trained. I have to learn how to do that job. And that's true no matter whether I'm experienced or not coming in. There are going to be specific aspects of my role in this organization that I have to learn. In fact, I think, and this is me speaking, not Newton, but I've seen many people fail in coming into an organization and simply applying in a cookie-cutter kind of way something they learned in another organization. Every organization is different, and even if you fulfill the same role in that other organization, this one may be different. Suppose you're a professor, moving from this institution to that institution. The students here are likely to be somewhat different. The structure of the course offerings is likely to be somewhat different. And so you're going to have to adapt to this new organization. Now, in most cases, for a teacher, that's not radically different. But in the corporate world, it's often quite different. You'll move into a new company and you find that your expectations are different. Even if your job is to manage that group and you manage the analogous group in a different company, you'll find that the different personalities involved, the different people within the company, the different structure of the company, the different projects that that company is engaged in will shape the responsibilities of your job and the criteria that are involved in determining what it is to do that job well. So it is highly context sensitive, and it is a mistake to simply think, oh, I've done this before, I know how to do this, and go into a new organization and think you have nothing new to learn. You have a lot new to learn. So that's the first part of this, learning those new aspects of your role. The second part is then developing the facility to do those well, developing your competence. But as Aristotle stressed, it's not enough to sort of learn what's expected of you and then start imitating that, start doing those things. He says we learn by doing, and the same is true on the job as in other aspects of life. But in addition, when do I really have the virtue? Really, when can I be said to excel? Not just when I can do it, but when doing it has become second nature to me, where I don't have to think about it. Now, I want to be careful here because there are certain kinds of tasks that are complex enough that I do have to think through every step. I don't want it to become completely second nature because becomes too easy to leave something out. I don't know if any of you have ever been in the cockpit of an airplane and flown or been a co-pilot on an aircraft. But there is a checklist. There's typically a little roller, and people go down the checklist of the various things to do. No matter how experienced the pilot, no matter how many times you've flown, even flown that particular plane, you don't just say, oh, it's second nature. Now, in getting into a car, it is second nature. Most of us don't have a checklist. But in an airplane, it's a long list. And you've got to do them and do them in the right order. If you leave anything out, you might die. And so it's very important to take every step. That means, yes, good to have lots of things become second nature, but you don't forget the list. You still go down the list and check it. Nevertheless, to do a job well and to really excel at it means taking at least large aspects of that job and making them second nature. You've actually internalized it. And then you can move one step further. You can actually become creative. You can become innovative in that job. You can think, not only do I know how to do this and it's become second nature to me, but now I can find ways of doing it better. So true excellence isn't just mastering the task and no longer having to think about every single detail. It becomes largely automatic. You are now in a position where you can say, aha, now that it's become automatic, I see this is an even better way of doing it. What if we did it this way? And so on. You can get creative. You can get innovative. You can do a better job than people even thought of doing before. Newton stresses that we are social animals. And that means that taking on a role in a company, working, doing our jobs, is not just something we have to do to eat. It's not just something we do to get a paycheck. It is something that expresses our very nature. We do it because that's who we are. We are people who live in groups, who take on roles in groups. And so to take on a certain role within a group that is a company, to do that in a business setting, is not something foreign to our nature. It is something that is an expression of our nature. Marx thought of labor as something that, within a certain kind of economic system at least, is alienating. It's something that split us apart from our nature. Newton says, nonsense. Doing that kind of thing, taking on a role in a company, that is something that is an expression of our nature. We voluntarily join a group. We take on a role in that group. Certain expectations are placed on us, and we take on those expectations, those criteria for what it is to do that job well. To live well is to be a good member of the various communities we're part of, and that means it's to fulfill our roles well, to do our jobs well. I have a certain job at the office, I have a certain job in my family, I have a certain job in my neighborhood, I have a certain job in other organizations I'm a part of, and to live well is to fulfill those roles well. It's to do those jobs well. The very fact that I take on many different roles in different groups, however, does mean that conflicts are possible. They're certainly possible within a given role, but it's also possible for these roles to have conflicting expectations, conflicting criteria of excellence, conflicting particular responsibilities, and I have to know how to resolve those conflicts. So Newton here is agreeing with Solomon that conflict resolution is important, but she points to several additional characteristics of these kinds of responsibilities, the criteria that govern our roles, and the ways in which they interact, that I think Solomon doesn't fully bring out. The first of these is uncertainty. These roles are typically somewhat uncertain. How far does my role extend? How extensive exactly are these responsibilities? Now, with some jobs, this might not be very complicated. I decide to take on a job mowing lawns in my neighborhood, and it may be quite specific what my responsibilities are. I'm to mow the lawn twice a month. I'm to edge along the sidewalks. I am to be careful of the plants and not disrupt them, and so on. And okay, those are my responsibilities. They're pretty clearly laid out. I know what the boundaries are. Even then, there can be uncertainties. How frequently should I be doing this? It may be on a set schedule, but in many parts of the country, how much the grass grows depends hugely on the weather. How hot is it? How much rain has there been? And so on. So maybe it's defined in those terms. That creates some uncertainty. Gee, should I go over and mow somebody's lawn there? It's getting a little long. I'm not sure. So there is that kind of uncertainty. But there are other kinds of uncertainty. The auditor may think, just how much time do I have to devote to actually going over these invoices? After all, this looks okay, but am I certain that we actually received the goods that we're being billed for here? How far do I have to go to track all of these things down, take care of all the potential sources of fraud or manipulation or misappropriation of funds and so on? It may be unclear just how far my responsibilities as an auditor extend. And the same thing can be true for other things. The attorney is asked to research a certain thing. Well, maybe they find a clear-cut answer, but maybe they don't. They say, well, here's one precedent that seems to indicate this. There's another one here we might be able to use in the case. Now, presumably that person could spend the rest of their lives in the law library searching for additional citations that might be relevant to the case. How far does the responsibility extend to do the search? The same thing might be true in academia. You have to write a paper on a certain topic. You want to make sure you're familiar with some of the main things in the literature. But just how far do you have to go? It might be that thousands of papers have been written on this topic in the past. Do you have to read everything ever written about this? Maybe nobody could even do that. Is it the kind of thing that, well, you just read the main ones? How far does your responsibility extend? It's a hard question to answer. The second factor is ambiguity. Often job descriptions are written in such a way that it's kind of ambiguous exactly what's required. And so there's a kind of uncertainty that goes with this ambiguity as well. It might be that you're asked to manage a certain project, for example, or to direct the following group. Well, what does direction actually mean? What is required in order for you to manage the project? To what extent are you expected to give people specific directions on how to do their jobs? To what extent can you simply organize general tasks and delegate responsibilities to the various people you're working with? Those are hard questions to answer. To some extent, you might say, look, it's just unclear, again, what the extent is, so I think uncertainty and ambiguity kind of blend together here. But the fact is that certain terms that are often used in business, like manage or direct or oversee, they don't have very clear meanings. They're somewhat ambiguous. They're rather vague in addition. And so there are many different dimensions of indeterminacy we could talk about here. But all of that means it's not always very clear exactly what your responsibilities are. A kind of ambiguity that affects people a great deal, and when I've talked to people in business about the moral dilemmas they face and the moral problems they've encountered, they often mention this question of who should decide a certain question. That is often rather ambiguous. A certain decision comes up. Is this something I should delegate to those below me? Is it something I have the responsibility of making? Is it something that I should leave to my superiors? What level of organization goes with what kind of problem and what kind of decision? That's a hard question to answer. And there's often a lot of ambiguity in the organizational structure about who really has the responsibility. Now, often people will say, well, the buck stops here. In other words, ultimately it's the person at the top who has responsibility. It's their job to keep track of things and to make sure the decision-making goes well. But after all, lots of decisions are made down at much lower levels. And what decision goes at which level of the company is often something that isn't very determinately spelled out. So there's a lot of ambiguity of that kind as well. Finally, of course, conflicts. We've talked already about conflicts that can occur within a role, because there may be various responsibilities attached to that one role in the company. And then, of course, conflicts between my roles in business and my roles in other dimensions of my life. But Newton points out an additional kind of conflict that I think is very interesting, which is that organizations change, institutions change, and circumstances, of course, change. All that means that people can be asked, even within the same job, to take on new responsibilities. And so there are ways in which we have to face conflicts between our old conception of our role and a new conception of their role. This is especially acute, I think, for people who view themselves as change agents, which many managers do. They think, yes, it's my job to take something that's not working very well and make it work better. Well, yes, but now there's been a certain conception of everybody's responsibility within this group, let's say, and you are trying to change those responsibilities, that means people are going to have an old conception of their role. You're trying to supplant that with a new conception of the role. But a lot of things are presumably going to be carried over and not changed. There's some indeterminacy there. What aspects exactly of the old role still apply? Which aspects are changing? But in addition to that, we've now got a conflict between people's former conceptions of what their job was and what the criteria of excellence were, and the new conception. It can be hard to reconcile those. And so sometimes people will think, well, now I'm expected to do this. But wait, I mean, I've been expected to do that. How do I combine those things? Am I now required to do both? I mean, there seems to be a conflict between the role I have been expected to play and this new expectation on me. How do I resolve that? So that's an important source of conflict too. Solomon tends to stress that this is a matter of virtue and that it's not helpful to think in terms of rules or principles. Newton says, well, it's important not to get too hung up on that distinction. After all, many times I can think of virtues or think of accompanying principles. I can think of honesty as a virtue, or just the principle, be honest. I can think about loyalty as a virtue, or I can think that I have to follow the principle, be loyal. I can think about kindness as a virtue, or I can think, be kind to others. And I can think of that as a principle I should live by. So she says, don't worry too much about the distinction between principles and virtues. To some extent, they're interchangeable. What we need to think about carefully is rather which principles, which virtues are relevant to our particular roles. And how do we resolve conflicts between principles, if you want to think of it that way, or between conceptions of virtue, criteria of excellence. However we want to frame the problem, it's basically the underlying problem of having a multiplicity of expectations placed on us, or criteria of excellence, or conceptions of virtue, or principles, or what have you, that we cannot simultaneously fulfill. We have to make trade-offs. We can go for this and do that to some extent, but only at the cost of failing to do that. And so those are the kinds of things we have to worry about. How do we integrate the various roles that we play, the various virtues, the various excellences that we develop? That's a hard question. And it's not really one we can answer in the abstract. It requires a deep knowledge of human beings and human institutions. We have to understand the roles people play, the ways in which they function together in larger communities, and within the personality, the character of one person. So we have to understand what makes people tick, what makes communities tick, what makes organizations tick, in order to understand what it is to integrate all those things well. That's a hard job, and it requires not just ethics, as often rather narrowly conceived as one particular branch of philosophy. It requires a deep understanding of human being, human institutions, and human society in general. And so Newton says the most important thing here isn't to define the right set of virtues or the right set of principles. Instead, nor is it even to come up with the right method for resolving conflicts. It's to take good people, wise people, and put them in positions of responsibility. Don't worry so much about who has exactly which job skills. Worry about getting the right people. And then they'll learn the job. They'll develop the required skills. They'll develop the excellences they need. So she says, really in the end, living well as just doing your job well requires resolving these conflicts well. Who's going to be able to do that? The person with practical wisdom. The person who really is just a good, virtuous person. So to say good employees are good people has a kind of double meaning. In part, our lives are defined by the roles we play, and so to be a good person is to do our jobs well. But in addition to that, what is it to do even one job well? It's in part to resolve conflicts well. And good people are the ones who are best at doing that. So here's your task as a business leader. It's to put good people in positions of responsibility. So you've got these conflicts being resolved by people you can trust to resolve them.